again to those of you here. Morning, first time for those of you joining us online. We are going to back into the book of Jonah. It's nice to be with you today and see sunshine coming through the glass here. This is a spectacular feeling. I was out snowblowing last night, and then this morning I was wondering if I was going to need to snowblow just to get out of my driveway. But I did. I didn't have to, so I just drove out, and now I'll have to deal with it in the afternoon. Yeah. So something to look forward to. We're going to jump into Jonah 2, and I just want to, I just kind of want to talk through what happens here. It's a really interesting book of the Bible. It's this short story that happens, and I thought it was a fun way to kind of start out the year. We've been running through Matthew for so long together. If you need to look it up in your Bibles, it's about here on your phones. Look it up, Jonah. You can type in a search field. If you type in Jonah 2 anywhere on the internet, it'll probably pop it up for you. But it's a little more than halfway through the Bible. It's headed towards the second half for sure. Jonah was a character, we talked about it last week. He's this messenger from God is how he's identified and what his role is. He's someone that hears from God and gets a message to share to others. And so in the time of history this was happening with the Jewish people, they called him a prophet. And one of the things that we find interesting going on here in this book is right away he gets a job direct from God, and he starts running in the very opposite direction, right? So that's kind of the tone of what happens. And so then we get to the end of the first chapter, and it kind of really is the beginning of this one. So I'm going to actually read Jonah chapter 1, verse 17, and then jump right into chapter 2. And we'll read, and then we're going to get going. I'm hoping for it to be a bit of a shorter day, just so you know, because there's a potluck, and I can smell it from here. And so, if your mind's like mine, it will drift very easily, especially based on the smells around you. So, let's jump in. Jonah chapter 1, verse 17. It's right at the end, right before 2. And then I'm just going to read through. So you can hang with me if you just want to read along or listen or however you want to do it. Now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from inside the fish. He said, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I called to you from the world of the dead, and Lord, you heard me. You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, O Lord, you have driven me from your presence. How will I ever again see your holy temple? I sank beneath the waves, and death was very near. The waters closed in around me, and seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. I was locked out of life and imprisoned in the land of the dead. But you, O Lord my God, have snatched me away from the yawning jaws of death. When I had lost all hope, I turned my thoughts once more to the Lord. And my earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. Those who worship false gods turn their back on all God's mercies. But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill all my vows. For my salvation comes from the Lord alone. Then the Lord ordered the fish to spit up Jonah on the beach, and he did. The story that happens here, just to give you a recap, if you weren't with us before or whatever, right? Jonah, it's a very common story. We see it kind of all over the place in Sunday schools and stuff. It's a really exciting, interesting story. You've got a guy that runs away from God after he hears from him. It's not even that other people are telling him this is what God wants you to do. It's that he himself hears from God and then runs in the opposite direction, gets out in the middle of the ocean. All kinds of chaos and panic ensue. He's fallen asleep under a boat. He's down in the hold of the boat, fallen asleep. All the sailors and everyone who knows anything about sailing and ocean, is freaked out. And so they wake him up, they get him up, and he's like, wow, I know what's going on. I'm running away from God, and so he's stirring all this up. He's making this happen, and it's my fault. And the sailors, full of mercy and grace on him, are like, oh, well, yeah, but what did you do? Why did you do that? And they try everything humanly possible to save him. Even when he's telling these sailors, please just throw me over in the ocean and all this will stop. If you just toss me out of this boat, this whole mess is over. And they're like, no, we're not like that. We're not so selfish that we would like risk a human life to just like end this, storm. So they try everything they can. And finally, they're like, there's nothing left for us to do. We have only one option, is to throw this guy over. And as they're doing it, they're like, God, have mercy on our soul and his. Like, we don't want to do this. And they toss him over, and it goes still instantly. And it says he was swallowed up by a fish in that moment. This is where we find Jonah. There's this new scene enters. It's pure darkness. You can only hear a voice. You can only imagine the smell, if you will, of the scene. And from inside of the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. And he says this really key thing in the end of verse 2. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. You see this situation where a guy runs as far and as fast in the opposite direction of what God has for him. God brings this punishment to strike on him, and yet the second that he goes and says, God, we need to talk, there he is, present. I think it's something that, for me, when I've read this story before and I've heard it before and experienced, people talking about this, I think some of the times I've really glazed over it. But when we think about our lives and the chaos that ensues in our lives sometimes, and we find ourselves, how fascinating is it that, when the life is at its worst, first of all, there's no, the saying, right? I think I said it last time I was here. It's there's no atheists in foxholes, right? It's when life blows apart, all of a sudden, everybody's interested in the idea and the concept of prayer. Speaking to the divine, having a connection with the divine. And so he's in this state where he is experiencing that. Everything has gone wrong. There's nothing going right in his entire life. He doesn't know what is going on. And he calls out to God, and it's such a profound statement that he answers. The divine one, the one that he worships, the one that controls the waves, the one that controlled that fish, the very place that he's in, and he has a communication with him. God didn't shut the door because of disobedience. It wasn't like this father figure that is shut out now. It's I gave you a chance, kid. I'm telling you what to do, and if you don't listen, that's it. There's this mercy. You see God in his mercy saying, I know you don't deserve to have a conversation with me right now. We've established that you're not really interested in doing the things that I value and that I have plans for. That's not what God does. He just starts into the conversation. He says, from the deep of the realm of dead, I call for your help, and you listen to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very hearts of the seas, and the currents swirled about me, and all your waves and breakers swept over me. We had an opportunity to take our girls to the ocean this year, and it's really interesting. Even though we have waves in some of our Great Lakes and stuff, I was thinking about the action that happened, when, especially Avalyn, who's the younger one, encountered a big wave for the first time that was taller than her, and the amount of force of the water that took over her, and just feeling that, or if you've ever gone out pretty far into the ocean and you feel the waves pulling you under, so you understand the immense power. And so he's in all this space and he's seeing all these things, but I find it so interesting that at the beginning of verse 3, this weight, this fear, this tension he's feeling, even then he's recognizing that what happened up there above the surface, what happened on the boat, he says, you hurled me into the depths. These guys, these people who worship pagan gods, he's going to even talk about pagan gods later in this prayer. But these guys who don't have any clue who God is, doesn't know what, don't know him from anything. And these kind, merciful sailors, and they throw him into the water, and yet Jonah is saying, no, that was an act of God. You guys acted on behalf of God and threw me into the water there. And that's where I find myself caught up in this place that I don't have any control. I don't have the power to do anything. These swirling waves, this control that's over me, I don't have control over my own body in this space. I've been banished from your sight, yet I will look again to your holy temple. He talks about this idea that God has put him into a place where he can't physically see God. This experience of like this physical break of connection. The Jewish people had such an interesting relationship. And he says, towards your holy temple. When the Jewish people were cast out of the land and they were taken away from their temple, from their original lands, and taken all over the world and dispersed all over, they would find ways to point their heads back towards Jerusalem, towards the temple, and pray, recognizing that that was the place that God had chosen to build a house where he would live among his people and be a place of worship for them. And so he's doing that thing, even in this space. He's saying, God, he's saying, I don't know where it is, but to the best of my abilities, in this darkness, in this confinement, in this space that I have no control over my body or where I'm going or what's happening to me, in my heart I'm looking to your temple. It's not a small thing. In Daniel, you see Daniel actually being put in the lion's den. How many have heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den? At least just vaguely, right? Like a story of a guy that gets thrown into the lion's den for praying to God. He was doing that, and the reason why they saw him doing that was he was a good Jewish man who was looking out a window pointed towards Jerusalem to pray. He didn't just take time to pray silently and quietly and hidden away. He did it in a space. And so even in this place, Jonah is looking and saying, I just find it interesting. He's like, hey, I'm doing my best here, God. Like, I realize what's going on. I can't see. I don't know where's up, down, sideways, or anything like that. I don't know what's happening. I have no control over my life right now. But I do recognize, and I point myself back towards your temple. That's where I look. The engulfing waters threatened me, and the deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought me up from the pit. He talks about this place, and I find it a really interesting illustration where he's fully submitted himself to death in this place. And some would say that like this prayer, this thing that was written was something that went on in that space, in that darkness, in that broken place. And was just this deep awareness of his lack of control over anything. He took everything. In the first chapter, we look at a guy who did everything in his own physical control to run as far and as fast from God's plan for him, from God's request, from God's direct message that he was supposed to deliver, and ran as far and fast from it as he could. Everything in his own control. And he comes to a place where he's literally at the point of death, and he says, I don't have any control. But you brought my life up from that pit. And I think from that point of this deep, deep understanding that he is not the one in control, that he has so little control when we really think about how we have in our own lives, how much control we think we have of our own lives. We love control. This was a theme I was thinking about when I was studying through this yesterday. Humans love control. If we can have control of our own destiny, it's in fact one of these immensely powerful things that we talk about with mental health struggles and with family struggles and all these things, is we look at people and we understand that we want to control their actions, they want to control our actions. It's like it's this never-ending dance in humanity where we're trying to understand like how much we control or don't control, and how we can essentially manipulate a situation. Even for those we love and care the most about, we're trying to manipulate them for good. You know what I'm saying? We're trying to control them, like help our kids make better choices and things like that. Control is such a deep part of us, and I see this all dissolving in his prayer here. It's all going away. He's like, the reality is I got no control. When it comes to you, God, when it comes to the real end of all things, when it comes to the real control of everything that exists, I've got nothing on you. Verse 7 says, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. And my prayers rose to you, to your holy temple. At the very point of death, at the loss of everything, then he finally comes back to God. And Jonah is he's not a hero. I think it's one of the most interesting books, especially in this portion of the Old Testament, because a lot of the prophets and a lot of the ones who wrote were really heroes. They were shining lights in these really dark times. Jonah's a bit of a loser. He's at the point where he's like hearing from God, He's hearing directly from God, and yet he still has to be at the very point of death to accept what God's plans are for him. He's no shining light. He's not this bright, brilliant bulb, in the chandelier. He's the one that's kind of like, why is it here? And that's why I find it so fascinating. God using these broken people. We don't just see in this book that we have just bright, shining people. We see broken, terrible people in so many ways still being used by God to do great things. So Jonah says, I remembered you, my prayer rose to you in your holy temple. And so he looks again back to that. He's like, it's about this thing. And I think one of the things that this, when we think of a temple today, like people might be like, oh, you can kind of equate it to a church or this experience that you have within a church building. But I really want to kind of talk about that just for a second, because to the Jewish mind, it was not just a building or a place where you could experience the presence of God or that you made sacrifices. It was all those things. But it was an anchor point of truth and the existence of God. Like, because it existed, God existed. Because God existed, the temple existed. It was this intertwined core of truth that was happening. And so Jonah's looking at it and saying, like, I'm going to recognize what's really true. This is the end of everything. I know this is the end. I accept it, God, I get it. And he looks to the temple, he looks back to truth and says, like, you're the one in control. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, my salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Jonah comes to a complete point of just recognizing his lack of any control or ability over the situation, lays it out, and says, God, I'm gonna say my salvation comes from you. It's the only thing it comes from. And at that point, there he is, thrown up, back to base one. We'll see, he's headed back in the right direction. God gave him some alternate transport from the boat. God redirected. I think one of the things that you can take away from this is, like, I look, this is anecdotal and experiential, and I understand that. But I see consistently in our lives some of the hardest things that we face, some of the times that we feel our darkest and the least connected with God. When we look back in that process, it's one of the things that has pushed us back in the direction of where he's taking us. It moves us into a better place. And that's not always a place that we want to be. And that, like I said, this is anecdotal. This is some of my own experiences. But I don't know, when you're in the process of following the teachings of Jesus, and you're trying to live a life that is internally transformed, and that wants to see people treated the way that you would want yourself to be treated, you're going to start to encounter people and experiences similar to Jonah, where you're like, I'm really good being kind and loving and caring to this many people, but when it comes to this political affiliation or to this standard of life or this opinion, that's where I draw the line, God. Like, this is where it is. And so I have done that throughout my life in different ways and different experiences. And what I have experienced, and maybe some of you have as well, that sometimes God has to take you through some really rough things to show you that you don't get to pick who God puts in your life, where you're headed, where your next steps will lead. You don't really get to pick those. We're just a small part of experiencing that happening. And we can either go kicking and screaming, trying to run in the opposite direction, or we can more quickly and more readily, as we experience this over and over again, recognize, okay, there's this truth, there's this anchor point of truth that I know that God has control over everything. Our temple, our ideal, our system of faith, that we can say, listen, I know these things are true, these things are pure, and I want to hold on to those. I can recognize it, and God, I don't have to like it, but I will tell people that, like, my hope is in you. I will tell people that My only salvation comes from you. I will tell people that, like, I don't like doing this, but I do this because it's right, it's good, it's true. And those are the things that, when you see this point, I have the idea of being vomited into a place. There's some things in life, even right now, that I'm facing, and it's like I don't want to be involved in this process. There's evil in our world that we face regularly, and it's not always easily identifiable. And you find ways to shelter yourself in different ways from it, and you move on through life. And then there's things like recently I've been experiencing where I'm being dragged into this process of God's interested in justice in the situation. And I'm like, God, I love that you're interested in it, but I just don't have the emotional, the physical, the mental bandwidth to be part of this. And I feel like I've been vomited. I feel like I've been like taken against my will and brought into this space. And that's okay. I wanted you guys to know that that's something that I'm processing right now. I was talking to Carly about it last night. It's like I don't want to be doing any of this. I don't want to be involved in this. Like I just want to be done with it. Like there's nothing but hurt and damaged lives and sin and just hateful behaviors, and I don't want to be involved in this. And I have tried in many different ways to just keep my head down, keep myself headed to Tarshish in this process. And through a series of experiences, God has sent this whale in the shape of a really caring and kind person that 3-4 weeks ago I didn't know from anyone in the world. And this person has shown that they care more deeply about the people that I care about and love, and they care more about justice and truth than I could ever do. And so I've been kind of going through this process of being spit back up, headed into the right direction. And I don't like it. I don't know where it's going to take me. I feel I've got a bit of a Jonah story coming, and I, even though I know where it's going, I don't have to, but I don't have to like it. I just have to recognize what God's doing and be willing to follow. And I don't know what your guys' lives are like. I don't know if you have those spaces in your life where you're experiencing those things. Man, the teachings of Jesus are immensely simple and immensely profound. And the transformation that happens, because it's so deep, like the profoundness is the deepness, because those changes are so deep, it's not easy. If it becomes easy, then we're not really being transformed. If there's not that hurt, if there's not that burn, you're not really building the muscle, so to speak. You're not building your faith. And I know that that's something that we can all face. I know that we all have things that we're facing down, things that are good, things that are rough, things that God's telling us that we need to be involved in or do. And we can always find reasons to run to Tarshish. But like, man, it's just the whole being vomited up on the shore against your will. Like, it's real. I don't like it. Like, it stinks in every sense of the word. Like, it's not something enjoyable. And even though you experience it, you keep doing it, it's like, man, Pete, you got to learn. But hey, like, follow God's plan, man. Don't be Jonah. It's like, it's one of the things we don't have to do. That's why these stories, that's why we have these dim bulbs like here in Scripture, is to be like, hey, not everybody got it. Like, you can do this the wrong way. It's not everybody's a shining light, but God's still going to be doing something. God's system, the world continues with or without our approval. Like that, I think that's a really key thing here. What is planned, what is set before us continues with or without our approval. So we can be on the right side of it or the wrong side of it, but that's all there is. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today on Jonah 2. We're here, and there's food downstairs, and we can be together. Dean and Maxine are here today, so it's nice to see them so we can visit a bit. And I just want to pray, and then yeah, we'll have the team come up for some music. And then after music, if we could just take a second and do like local prayer time, like we've done before, if that's okay. And I'll pray for the meal as well, and then we can head straight down for food, right? So let me pray real quick, and then we got a song or two. So, all right. Hey, God, thanks for today. Thank you for those joining us online. God, we just... we have this human tendency to try to run away from things we don't like, that we don't agree with, that we don't believe in. And for us as people, it's a continuing learning experience. If it was all the same, it'd be simple, but life changes, people around us change, and impacts of life drag out, and we have to face it. So God, we just... recognize that we have to anchor ourselves to a truth and look for what is truly good and head in that direction. Thank you for Scripture, these people that are good, bad, and ugly that you allow us to see, that you've recorded for us to have here today so we can learn. And help us to be people that are transformed, and that we want to see our world be a place that is glorifying to you. In your name, amen.